Back when the Bible was written, then edited, then rewritten, then rewritten, then re-edited, then translated from dead languages, then retranslated, then edited, then rewritten, then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts, then rewritten, then translated again, then given to the Pope for him to approve, then rewritten, then edited again, then rewritten again, all based on stories that were told orally 30 to 90 years after they happened to people who didn't know how to write. So, all right, I have seen this meme all over the place, and we are going to talk about that today. Hey guys, it's Dwayne here. So today I want to talk about this meme that I've seen absolutely everywhere. If you're on social media, chances are you have run into this meme, especially if you're in any of those like religion debate groups or Christianity versus atheism groups or anything like that. This typically comes up very frequently. So I want to take some time here and share with you some of the things that I think are just not right about this, where it misrepresents a lot of the facts that are in actuality historical. It took me a bit because I didn't recognize who David Cross is. I didn't know who he was until I did a quick search on him and realized that he's actually a stand-up comedian. So we have a stand-up comedian giving us advice on how we should handle the Bible, or I should say giving us historical context of where the Bible came from. Did he do any research to determine if any of this was true? I don't know. I suspect he didn't, but if he did, he didn't do it very well. So let's take a look at some of the points that he made. So before we get started, I found the video, that little clip where he does his little stand-up routine and tells us this very quote. So I'm going to take a second here. It's about a minute long and share that with you. I'll cue that here.
How all the prophecies, how completely antiquated they are. Because, you know, when the Bible was written and then rewritten and then edited and then re-edited and then translated from dead languages and then retranslated and then re-edited and then re-edited and then retranslated and then given to kings for them to take their favorite parts out and then re-edited and then retranslated and then re-edited and then given to the Pope for him to approve and then retranslated, then rewritten, then rewritten, re-edited, retranslated, re-edited again, all based on stories that were told orally 30 to 90 years after they happened to people who didn't know how to write. So, I guess what I'm saying is the Bible is literally the world's oldest game of telephone.
All right, so I'll just draw attention really quickly at the end there. He suggests that the Bible is perhaps the oldest game of telephone in all of history. And then he gets a few ha-has from the crowd. We're going to take a look at that. But first, I want to break down what it is that he said here. Okay, so in this quote, I gathered about 4 points that he's trying to get across. Now, let's be clear here. He's a stand-up comedian, and he's probably more concerned with making the crowd laugh than he is with actually giving us factual information about the history of our Bible. So let's talk about those 4 points. He talked about the Bible being 1, re-edited, 2, retranslated. He talked about popes and kings changing it, and then he talked about people did not know how to write back then. So we're going to take a look at these 4 points one by one. So number 1, re-edited. What does he mean by re-edited? I really don't know. This is a quote with very little context, and re-edited could be a number of things. Edited may be to go through and fix spelling mistakes. Editing may be going through and changing out some words to make something that sounds a little bit nicer. If this is the case, we have to ask the question, who re-edited it and when? Now, the New Testament, I'm going to focus specifically on the New Testament just because that's something that I've worked a ton more with historically than the Old Testament. So the New Testament would have been through this process of copying throughout the centuries. And the really cool thing about this copying thing that's been going on is we actually have manuscripts from the early centuries. I mean, we probably heard about Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Decent witnesses to the text. We can go back further. There's something called the John Rylands Papyrus, which takes us back into the 2nd century. We're talking about 125, 150 AD. Like, this is incredible stuff. So if it was re-edited by somebody, the person who's done the re-editing has to have gone back and changed all those manuscripts so that we wouldn't know that it had been re-edited. The facts are just not on his side. The Bible had not been re-edited in the sense I think he's getting it across. So that brings us to point number 2, retranslated. The Bible's been retranslated so many times. It's translation of a translation of a translation. But again, this is just not true. It is just not true. When we see a translation of the Bible, whether it's the English Standard Version or the New King James Version, you know what sources are consulted? The original languages. When you have yourself a good English translation, it was translated once. It was not retranslated ever. It was translated once. We go back into the manuscript tradition, the scholars do, and they put the translation together, and you have it translated once. I mean, there are some instances, Catholic Bibles, which are an English translation of a Latin translation of a Greek translation. But that's not, by any stretch of the imagination, anything that is normal to occur. So the Bibles that we have in English, your standard translations, your New American Standard, your English Standard Version, your New King James Version, all that kind of stuff, they are all translated from the original source languages. So there is no retranslation. Now, in talking about that, I want to talk about the term we use when we talk about translations. We call them versions. So sometimes when we say version, people can get the wrong idea that we're actually having something that's totally different, that, we have a version 1 Bible here with one message, and then we upgrade the message and we change a whole bunch of things and we have version 2. But that's not how we use the word version. Really, in our regular vernacular language, the term version is synonymous with translation. So we don't have different versions in the sense of software, which, version 1, version 2 is better, has more functionality. It doesn't work like that. We have multiple translations. Can be a bit confusing, but that's what we mean. So these different versions or different translations of the Bible are essentially the same message. So point number 3 that I think he's trying to get across here is he says that popes and kings have changed it by removing parts they don't like and putting in their favorite parts and stuff like that. But how much of that is actually factual? The question we have to ask is, if this did occur, which king made which changes and how do you know that? Or which pope made which changes and where do we find a reference to that? Because like I said, we have all these manuscripts that occurred before all of these kings and popes came along. And if they made a change, we would know about it because we could reference manuscripts which had came before them. So if they really wanted to make changes, they would have to go through the entire manuscript tradition and change those so that we wouldn't suspect what they had changed. It just didn't happen the way that he suggested it. Now, some people have suggested that maybe the Council of Nicaea had something to do with the books that we have in our Bible. Was it somewhere in the 200s? A bunch of people met together, and according to some people, they came together in order to decide which books were going to be in the Bible. They would put them all on a table somewhere, and based on their thinking or the way they wanted things to go, they would choose which books. Maybe we'll take James here and we'll kick out the Gospel of Thomas, and we don't really like the book of Enoch, and Hebrews is a good book. Let's put that one in. So that didn't happen. The Council of Nicaea, it didn't come for the purpose of deciding the canon of Scripture, because what had happened is the church beforehand had already determined what the canon of Scripture was. What do I mean by canon? Well, a canon is just a standard or a rule. And what we find with the New Testament is that people from the early church had already adopted and accepted the books that we have in the New Testament. It wasn't that anyone went and decided I wanted this book to be in the Bible. It was more passively accepted as the books went into circulation. People knew who they were written by, and people knew what the content of these books were. And so they got circulated amongst the early believers. So you see, the distinction here is that the books weren't chosen. The books were simply recognized as already having authority. And that's when it comes down to this whole Council of Nicaea thing. The New Testament books had already been well established by the time the Council of Nicaea had come around. Okay, and lastly, point number 4 is David Cross makes this claim that people apparently didn't know how to write back then. Granted, illiteracy was really high back then. It's not like today where everybody can read. I get that. But there were clearly people who could write. There was an entire industry of people called scribes, and these were the people you hired to write the stuff down. In the case of the Old Testament, the documents themselves, the books themselves, often ascribe the author to it. Traditionally, we have Moses as writing the first 5 books, with the little snippet at the end being written by Joshua. We have the prophets' names attached to the books that were written by them. They weren't entirely illiterate, and people were capable of writing stuff back. This is almost self-refuting. The fact that we have a written book in front of us indicates to us that somebody knew how to write something. So that's point number 4. Now, lastly, I want to point out this fact, this whole telephone thing. That this isn't new. I've heard this many times before. And typically people will come who don't believe the Bible and say something along the lines of, well, it's just a telephone game. You know that game where somebody whispers something into the next guy's ear, and then they whisper it into the other guy's ear, and then the next guy and the next person and the next girl and whoever it is. And then by the time the message gets from the first person to the end of the line, it transmogrifies into something absolutely ridiculous, right? That's the nature of the game. The more ridiculous the message is at the end, the funnier it is and the more fun you have. Now the difference is, there's a couple differences. One is transmission of New Testament manuscripts, transmission of biblical manuscripts. It's not a game. Scribes were careful. They didn't just whisper something into the ear of the next person and then walk away. They consulted manuscripts and double-checked their work. We have many instances, one we're going to talk about a little bit later in Hebrews, in Vaticanus. But that's beside the point. There are many instances where there are correctors on there. There's many instances where people have gone in and made corrections to things as they were writing them out. This is all documented. This is not like a game of telephone. So all this to say is when it comes to the history of the biblical manuscript tradition, there's a lot of false information out there. And oftentimes, kind of like David Cross here, they've just done nothing more than parrot some of the arguments that just sound good, but may not necessarily be established in any sort of fact. So next time you hear somebody say something like, the Bible was re-edited 1,000,000 times, or maybe the Bible is just an old telephone game, well, now you have an answer to that question. Anyway, brothers and sisters, until next time, we'll see you around.